In the snowy highlands, a carriage, which consisted of men and several wagons and carriages, was traveling toward its goal. In one of these carriages sat the protagonist, who, looking out the window at such bad weather and thinking that she has a very bad feeling, so scrutinizing the scenery outside the window, she told the maid that they should have reached their destination before dark. At this time, Anna Maria gently reached for Curia's arm and informed her that she needed to be as careful as possible, as her arm was still injured. And afterward, she tearfully reported that Master had been too harsh with her, for even the previous wound had not yet healed. But then Curia smiled good-naturedly and said that everything was fine, and that she was glad to be able to go somewhere far away. Anna Maria shone with happiness and said that now all the horrible times in her life were over and she could rest, and in time people would change their attitude towards Rubinia Kishner. Curia was madly surprised by such a statement, so she asked Juana Marius what she had gotten out of it. But that one, seriously looking at the main character, said that it was because wherever Prince Rubinia Kishner had been before, she had been with him. Because of that, she hated them. And then she remembered a scene she had once seen. She had seen the last time the crown prince had told Rubinia Kishner that Curia had scars. Rubinia Kishner had only laughed. And afterward, with a smile on her face, she informed me that there are no decent men around the main character, so nothing can be done. It was because Rubinia Kishner constantly allowed herself to say something like this that people around her hated her. The protagonist only exhaled quietly and then said that maybe she should have thrown a cup or something at them during their last conversation. But in any case, her impression of these people would not be improved. One day, her fiancé with Rubinia Kishner came to her and asked her to break the engagement. The protagonist reacted to this quite calmly, even did not stop drinking her tea. The man to whom the protagonist was engaged is a prince she met 3 months before the engagement. She looked them over carefully, still thinking she should respond to something like this, but suddenly the crying girl was brought out of her musing, who tearfully wondered if the protagonist was going to change her mind. It was Rubinia Kishner, the lady of her future fiancé who shines beautifully even today. She clung to the prince's chest and cried, and he tried to comfort her, saying that he thought Curia would accept his request. She sobbed and said that they were madly in love and therefore should be together. But the protagonist watched the scene with disgust and embarrassment, unable to find the strength to respond in any way. Rubinia Kishner wiped away tears with her handkerchief and wondered if Curia wanted to separate them. Looking at all this picture, the main heroine realized that never before could not make a decision on her own. She just sat watching all this and did not understand when it would all end. These people had been dating behind her back for the past 2 years. And despite the fact that she was the prince's fiancé, Rubinia Kishner was always by his side. They were even spotted kissing each other more than once during balls and other events. All the aristocrats around saw what was happening, and so they whispered behind the protagonist's back, calling her the Snow Queen who lost a spring fairy tale, and also spread rumors about the protagonist. She sipped her tea quietly and thought that she had been a good target for gossip before. But after the news of the broken engagement, the gossip had become more frequent, and they become even harsher and more disgusting. Then she calmly exhaled and asked the crown prince if he felt any guilt at all. That one smiled awkwardly and informed that of course he feels it, but that doesn't mean that the royal family doesn't want to lose the favor of the Buchanan family. So the protagonist should take that into consideration. She only lowered her gaze looking at her cup and thought that apparently the prince wanted to divorce, but did not want to bear the political burden, and his insolence knew no bounds. Looking at her tea, the protagonist wanted to hit him, but the cup in her hands prevented her from doing so. The girl looked up and said that she understood what she was talking about and that she would withdraw from the engagement. The girl looked up and said that she understood what she was talking about and that she would give up the engagement. That one smiled contentedly along with Rubinia Kishner, and then the prince informed that she would naturally get what she should get. Rubinia Kishner snuggled against the prince's shoulder and informed him that she was insanely glad the girl had taken it so calmly. But she just watched them silently, and then realized that ever since she had first met Rubinia, the girl didn't look like a silly girl in love at all. But still she decided to let the moment pass. And tired after their conversation, she lay down on the bed. The protagonist indignantly said that the prince didn't want to break the engagement himself, so she would have to take responsibility for it herself. She was lying there and didn't understand how she could get to this point. But suddenly, Anna Maria entered her room and looked at the protagonist excitedly, asking if she was all right. Curia clearly looked quite depressed, and it didn't go unnoticed by Anna Maria, but the girl simply replied that she was fine and shouldn't worry. But the maid looked at her worriedly and wondered if she could use a spell and pluck out their eyes. The protagonist calmly got up and sat on the sofa, and afterwards informed that she was fine and it was not worth taking such a risk, and asked to make her some tea, as she had a very bad headache. The girl smiled happily, after which ran off saying that she would make a great tea as she is a pro at brewing. All this time, the protagonist remembered Rubinia and her face, which she was able to get what she wanted. The protagonist reflected that she knew absolutely nothing about Rubinia Kishner, except the fact that she was from an emerging aristocratic family from the neighborhood, and the girl had shown open hostility toward her before. Then she plunged into a memory where they were discussing something at one of the banquets where the protagonist spent time in the company of her girlfriends. Rubinia Kishner interrupted their conversation and turned to the protagonist and said that they did not see her guy with her and asked her who she had come with. The friends of the protagonist looked at Rubinia unhappily. Meanwhile, Curia calmly replied that she was accompanied by her father. She only grinned and said that she was insanely sorry for Miss Gilkaman, and then informed her that the crown prince had told her that he wanted to walk with her and be her escort, so there was no way she could refuse. The main character just remained silent, looking her over carefully and not wanting to comment on such a thing in any way. But then Laura, one of her best friends, stepped in and told Rubinia that she and Lady Curia were discussing something and asked her to leave. She wondered if it was some serious discussion she couldn't join, but she looked at her and told Rubinia Kishner that they were not accepting anyone into their discussions. The girl was clearly unhappy with such a refusal, but realized that she could not charge anything. So she smiled and said that the prince was already calling her to the pavilion, and so she had to leave. When the girls were left alone, Laura said that Rubinia Kishner is completely crazy because she dared to decorate someone else's fiancé. Another girl's second best friend of the heroine, Maria, said that also absolutely do not understand such behavior on the part of Rubinia Kishner. Then the protagonist excitedly turned to Laura and informed her that other people might hear her, and then it might reflect badly on her. But she was clearly furious and told the protagonist that she didn't care at all because Rubinia Kishner thought she was who knows who, and she should be grateful to the protagonist for still forgiving such unforgivable behavior. Remember all of this, the protagonist thought she was almost certain Laura would dance with Joe if she found out the engagement was broken. But afterward she wondered what would happen to Maria. But she was taken out of her musings by Anne-Marie, who came up to her and asked if she should prepare the papers. But the heroine calmly explained that she would have to pay a visit anyway, since the engagement was broken off. But suddenly, the elven ears of Anna Maria heard some sound, and she turned around frightened. But the protagonist did not pay attention to it and said that they need to think everything over and prepare for this conversation, since it came to this. But then the protagonist's father burst into the room, and angrily looking at his daughter, he beckoned her closer to him. Tam looked at him worriedly, expecting some sort of explanation. But the next moment, he slapped her face with anger, so hard that her hair flew apart. Initially, the protagonist was simply shocked by this behavior, but after admitting to herself that it was a very expected reaction on his part. So forcing herself, she smiled and, touching the bruised spot, suggested that in all likelihood the discussion of their engagement had not gone according to plan. But the next moment, hearing such a thing, the protagonist was struck again, already on the other side of the cheek, but she courageously bitching. It was Anna Maria who tried to intervene, but at that moment Curia gestured that she should not interfere or say anything. Otherwise, it could end badly for her. Then the girl, with all the confidence of looking at her father, asked how he could explain the fact that he had hit her twice. The enraged man asked how Curia could behave like that in front of the crown prince, but they calmly explained that at least the prince hadn't punched her twice in the face. He was about to take a swing at the girl and threatened that she should behave respectfully to him, and then asked her what had happened between them since she had decided to break off the engagement. He did not even listen to her explanations and said that if she had behaved as nobly and sweetly as Rubinia Kishner, the crown prince would never have suggested breaking off the engagement. But this resolutely clenched her hands into a fist and wondered, is he really so badly mistaken? In response to such a question, her father replied that she was losing a huge opportunity, namely the chance to become queen. But that one only smiled and sarcastically asked why her father would not marry the crown prince on his own. At the next moment, to Maria's horror, the girl was hit again with great force, and she could not bear it and just turned away. While enduring the beating, the protagonist remembered that she had obeyed her father all her life and listened to his instructions. He always said that Kyria should be noble and always determined, that she should be willing to sacrifice everything for her family. Her way of thinking should be that which suited an aristocrat like her, and also constantly said that she should marry the crown prince, because it was the order of the head of the family, and she could not refuse it. She looked at her father with all her determination and asked, until when was she to put up with this? For she had put up with it for a whole year, and even if she was treated like a child, because his fiancé had been stolen, she hoped her father because he had said earlier that she could not break the engagement. Remembering all the horrors and gossip she went through, the girl didn't realize when it would all come to an end. Her father did not listen to her at all and simply asked her why she had broken off her engagement to the crown prince. But she looked at him resolutely and asked him why he did not behave as he told her not to behave, for if he had been well, he would not have divorced her mother. He called his daughter ungrateful bitch was going to hit her, but suddenly on her defense became Anna Maria, covering her with her own hands and called the Lord to stop. The protagonist looked in horror at the girl that interceded for her and begged Anna Maria do not interfere. But she didn't back down and informed him that Lord couldn't do that. After all, she really didn't want Kyria to be beaten up. After all, it wasn't all her fault. But he only grabbed Anna Maria's hair with anger and then was about to do something to that maid. But Kyria's shout was sharply heard. He drew the man away, and he turned his gaze to the girl, informed her that she remained under house arrest and had to be at the villa until he told her to leave. She was staring at him intently, and I didn't know how to react, so the best solution was to keep silent. In the end, she and Anne-Marie looked after the departing count, who informed her that his daughter was as intolerable as her mother, and afterward reproached her and told her to think about whose money she had lived on before. At this time, the protagonist reflected that she didn't feel disappointed, not sad, as she didn't expect anything from him at all. So she ended up in this carriage, in the middle of snowy mountains. But every time she remembered the face of her father, who came up with this punishment for her, but the protagonist was not upset at all. Looking out her window at the winter scenery, she reported that the winter sea is not such a bad place, and afterward reflected that if one considered the worst possible outcome, one could consider herself very lucky. But the protagonist hoped she wouldn't be pestered in the capital about asking about the engagement, and it would be nice if her fiancé and Rubinia Kishner would get married soon while she was away. And after an evil thought, they really are a good couple, and someday there will come a moment when the prince will realize how wrong he was about Rubinia Kishner. Then the main character noticed that their carriage had been standing still for a long time. Anna Maria, who had been watching Kyria closely all this time, asked if she was cold, and then put a warm blanket over her shoulders to make her feel better. The girl thanked her maid for her concern, but assured her that everything was fine. But at that moment, footsteps on the crunching snow were heard behind a carriage. This did not go unnoticed by the protagonist, and so she transferred her attentive gaze outside the window. At that moment, the doors to the carriage opened and two men appeared. One of them was the head knight of those who had accompanied her. He turned to Lady Curie and informed her that they had a problem. Then the girl turned to Vladimir, and I asked him what had happened. He sadly informed me that due to the heavy snowfall, it was impossible to drive further, so they should find a place where they could take a break. The protagonist awkwardly wondered if they were planning to stop in the middle of a snowy forest, and then stated that they should have stopped in the previous town, since she had a bad feeling about it before. But suddenly my eyes focused on an unassuming man standing behind me. She realized that this man was their guide, and he was almost freezing to death. Then the knight said that the guide should have listened to Mrs. Kyria's request when she asked to wait in the last town. He tried to mumble something, then Vlader carefully looked at his face and asked what he wanted to say. And then he bowed to Vladimir and Lady Curia and told them that they could stop at a place together, which unfortunately is not on the map, but it is not far from where they stopped. It is a small mountain village called Hercula. After hearing all of this, Curia looked at him in surprise and asked him again if she heard his name correctly. The knight, however, didn't seem to be as favorable. He began to bare his sword and wondered how the man dared suggest to my lady such a suspicious place that wasn't even on the map. But he bowed and apologized and explained that it was actually a ghost town, but that it wasn't dangerous at all. And then he fell to his knees and bowed to my lady and said that was all he wanted to say, and said that he didn't want to die. The protagonist looked closely at his frozen hands and realized that his frostbite was becoming more serious and the snowfall was intensifying. It was then that she realized that they seemed to have no other choice. So looking carefully at the bowed man and Vladimir, she said that they should go. Vlader turned to Lady Curie and tried to object, but she explained that if they stayed here any longer, they would be in great danger. He finally agreed to do it, and then the protagonist turned to Anna and asked if she liked the idea of going to a village that wasn't even on the map. Then said that it was insanely interesting, so if the protagonist liked it too, then so be it. Curia was happy with her answer, then said that it was a better option than just wasting time anyway. Some more time passed. Eventually, the protagonist and her crew headed towards the statue that stood alone in the middle of the forest. She grudgingly noticed what looked like a dead end. At this point, Anna Maria also looked out of the window in an attempt to discern the surroundings, what lurked behind the blizzard, and wondering if this was their village. But at that moment, unexpectedly, a man came out and touched the statue. The protagonist mentally did not understand what he was doing, but suddenly, at the next moment, a gate appeared in front of him. Then the girl excitedly realized that Vidimodo, this was the entrance to the village, which had been disguised all this time. Anna Maria was also marveled at such a thing, and the protagonist only wondered that Vidimo is such a strong magic that can hide a whole village, and she did not understand who was capable of such a thing. When they drove in and she saw a lot of tall houses, and the girl was aghast, not realizing how a place like this couldn't be on a map. So their carriage drove on without hurrying and carefully passing the snowy streets. But suddenly there was a light under the wheels, and it spread out towards the monument. When he reached it, the stone woman's face also shone with a similar light. At this time, a deer was grazing somewhere on the frozen lake, but suddenly he was alarmed to notice that he, too, had been reached by this light, which spread across the ice of the lake. And so he was soon gone, and the cracks in the ice began to separate more and more. This light reached even to the center of the empire, where the boat on which Rubinia Kishner sat with the prince was sailing. But suddenly, in a moment, she turned excitedly and inquired of the prince if he had noticed anything strange. She looked excitedly at the water in front of her, which had already regained its usual color and lost its glow, and thought that she must have just imagined such a change. So when asked by His Highness what was troubling her, she just smiled awkwardly and informed him that the lake was very beautiful. He scrutinized the lady of his heart and said that the lake in the palace was famous for its beauty, but even the beauty of this lake could not compare with it. She was madly flattered by such a compliment. He asked her when their engagement was to take place. He gently took her hands and informed her that he would have to ask His Majesty's permission. And afterward, he kissed the back of her palm and informed her that even if the ruler did not allow them to do such a thing, he would give up his crown and marry her. The girl's face contorted with horror and disgust at what she heard, and it seems that such an outcome was not part of her plans at all, and such a decision of the prince would be a terrible mistake. But afterwards, she immediately realized that it was too early to think about it, so she smiled radiantly and told the prince that she was madly pleased and happy, and afterwards awkwardly informed him that her love had always been a loss to the crown prince. But it suddenly began to snow. The prince said that the heavens must have decided to bless them. She looked around admiringly and confirmed this, saying that she felt the same way. By this time, Curia had already reached her home, and they had settled into a small but comfortable inn. And afterwards, she decided that now she should try to relax a little. But suddenly, her gaze stayed on the window, and then she wondered if it was strange enough to be snowing at a time like this. So such oddities were beginning to surprise her more and more. Seeing the beautiful snow-covered streets and neat houses, the protagonist wondered why such a prosperous village was hidden, because it gave the impression of a rather neat and quiet town. So she turned to Anna Maria and asked what she thought about it. The maid was also staring mesmerized at the window without averting her gaze. When she didn't answer her, Kyria excitedly called her by name and wondered if she had seen something interesting. Then at last Anne-Marie turned to her and afterward informed her lady that she was madly afraid, for something terrible was near at hand, and it was truly enormous. The one looked excitedly at her maid and wondered what she meant by something horrible and asked her to explain. But there was really horrified and informed her that it was sleeping for now, but my lady needed to get out of here as soon as possible. The protagonist saw the obvious fright on the maid's face and did not understand what had happened to her, so she came closer and calmed Anna Maria and said that they would leave the place as soon as the snowfall stopped. She remained silent and then, to the protagonist's surprise, she volunteered to go make tea. Before she left, she told the protagonist that she would protect her and keep her promise. Afterwards, she hid behind the door, saying that she wanted to go to boil water. Kyria was watching her closely, and to her, this behavior was not at all like normal, and so she was very worried about the girl's well-being, and then gazed intently at the window through which Anna Maria had been watching until recently and wondered what was really behind it. What could have frightened the girl so much? Kyria looked at the window worriedly and realized that the girl wouldn't say things like that without a reason. So she decided to get closer and take a look at what she saw. But in the end, all the girl saw in front of her was the same tranquil city, which turned out to be quite quiet, and she can only see the scenery that opens from the window. But what bothered her the most was the unpredictable weather, and maybe it had something to do with what Anna Maria was talking about. But suddenly, she remembered their escort, who waved his hands asking them to go inside the hotel as quickly as possible. Then the protagonist realized that the man was strangely agitated, and initially the protagonist thought that it was because of the weather, but clearly he was hiding something. She decided to go looking for him. She remembered that he had said earlier that he would be living on the first floor, so she should go downstairs and check it out. She resolutely left her room and went down the corridors, not paying attention to the scenery hiding behind the windows, which were insanely similar to each other. But suddenly, a strange entity that looked like a dark haze appeared in one of them. And the next moment, this haze took human form, and eventually, a young man with a cane stopped somewhere on the roof of the building and watched with all attention this hotel where the protagonist had previously stayed. At this time, Kyria was calmly walking down the stairs, but she suddenly stopped abruptly when she heard the conversation between the two people. The hotel owner excitedly asked if the guide had completely lost his mind, and the agitated one tried to explain that he had no other choice and had observed the snow himself, so they should just keep quiet for a while, and then no one would know about anything. But the chief clearly was not pleased, and he indignantly informed that he simply couldn't believe that the man had actually brought strangers to a place like this. But the man was very angry and informed that he couldn't just let them freeze in place. The head of the house was absolutely not listening and said that because of their coming someone might wake up. At this point, the protagonist decided to give away her presence, and so she wondered who we were talking about and who might be awake. The head of the house reacted calmly enough to her appearance. At the same time, the conductor stammered to my lady, "Did they wake her up?" And after awkwardly informing her that they hadn't talked about anything in particular and offering to walk her to her room. But she resolutely looked into his eyes and asked him how he dared to deceive the count's daughter. She asked him what this city hides and why they are so much afraid of it. The guy guiltily lowered his head and shook with fear, and immediately informed her that he could not tell her about it. But the girl was not going to back down, so she told him that if he did not tell her what was going on, she would tell the count and they would have to be punished. It was ridiculous that someone who was supposed to be a guide would bring the count to a suspicious village. But the guide went on that he couldn't tell her anything and it wasn't his fault at all. But the girl did not listen to these excuses and said that she did not want to stay in such a suspicious place. And afterwards she asked whether the man did not understand what he really should be afraid of. The man, feeling guilty and frightened, said that he understood what they were talking about, but they themselves did not know completely what was going on. At this point, the head of the house spoke and slapped the guide on the back, and then turning to the protagonist reported that whatever it was, they call it the end. She retorted that she didn't mean it, and then said it's absolutely ridiculous if they think the end exists. He looked her over carefully and told her that she shouldn't worry about it. But in any case, nobles shouldn't act rashly. She scrutinized the head of the house and wondered how she should regard such a warning. But the man looked at her with all sternness, then said that his warning meant that she should not make a fuss here and there, for otherwise everyone around her would be in great danger. She looked at him calmly and told him that if he had said something like that to another nobleman, it would probably have ended much worse for him. But the head of the house did not listen to this and said that the end was not just a fiction as the nobles considered it. But the girl tiredly exhaled and said that she understood what was meant. She said that the man, like the children of this country, had grown up reading the legends of myth and fiction, and it was really scary. This whole verbal altercation was watched by the guide, who shifted his gaze excitedly from one to the other and back again, and afterwards, with a very guilty face, apologized to the girl and informed her that this village was insanely wary of outsiders. Then she turned around and told the head of the house that as soon as the snowfall stopped, they would leave immediately. But he looked excitedly at the girl and informed her that the snow never stops in these parts. At that moment, she was taken out of her thoughts by Anna Maria, who had run in and was outside all this time. Her face was all red and frostbitten, and as soon as Anna Maria was in the house, she slowly started to faint. And this was noticed by the main character, so after shouting her name, she approached her. In the end, some time passed and the maid was already lying in a warm bed in her room, and the protagonist unhappily stood over her bed and wondered why she had gone somewhere in such a snowfall. Because earlier she had said that she was going to make tea. She was agitated. Looking at Curia informed her that she went to check who this end was, and afterwards with shaking hands said that if the man starts talking to her, she should in no way answer her. Curia obviously saw such a strange reaction from the girl, so she asked what she meant. But she looked at her carefully and told her that she should lock the windows and doors and try not to make any noise, and then everything would be all right. She saw that this was not the time to argue with Anna Maria, so she agreed to her demands and said that whatever happened, she would not go outside. Only when Anna Maria heard this promise from the protagonist was she able to finally close her eyes to get some rest. Looking at the girl, the protagonist thought that Anna Maria smelled bad, and apparently some kind of sorcery or magic had been used on her. The girl sat beside her bed and lost her eyes tiredly. She obviously realized that everything that was happening in this village was absolutely abnormal. But then she looked out the window at the village, and afterwards she realized that at first glance this village was absolutely unremarkable. But the protagonist did not feel lively during her stay here, although she was sure there had been many people living here before. At this time, the building she was in was being closely watched by some black, mysterious, and sinister force. At that moment, even the girl was able to spot it. For amidst all the darkness of the evening, the darkness of this silhouette was still the thickest and glowed with blue. She unhappily looked away from the window and wondered what it could be, or who it was. At some point, she noticed that the previously incomprehensible silhouette was now much clearer, and a man's outline appeared, and he was looking in her direction. From such a stare, the girl was literally paralyzed and could not even breathe. She was shaken up, and at that moment she realized that this must be the reason why everyone in this village is so scared. The girl immediately realized that as soon as she looked outside that window, she immediately realized one thing, that silhouette was looking directly into her eyes. The protagonist was horrified to realize that he looked quite strange and frightening because in the middle of the night, when it was snowing, the man was in such light clothes, and she absolutely did not understand what kind of person it was. But as if hearing her thoughts, he just laughed, then turned and walked away. Only at the moment when she was free from his attentive gaze, the protagonist was horrified to realize that she could finally breathe normally, and after what had happened, her heart raced. She was terrified trying to find an answer for herself. Who was that man and why he was looking at her? She sat down afterward, still holding onto the table and her head with one hand, trying to explain what had happened to herself, but she didn't understand anything. The only thing she could see was that it was getting light outside. Then she realized that it seemed to her that only a few minutes had passed, but in fact it was already morning. The only thing she thought about as she stared at the scenery of the city was who the man was. After some more time had passed, the protagonist decided to finally rest after a sleepless night, but she couldn't calm down and sleep. The protagonist didn't understand where the girl could have gone, especially since she had been acting strangely since they had entered the village. So Kiria decided to make her own tea, then go look for the girl. She yawned tiredly and found that she must have had a short sleep, but still she wondered when her maid had left and why she had not said anything, since she had been gone so long that she had already made tea. Then walking around her room, she glanced uncertainly at the window and wondered if Anna Maria could have gone outside again. The thought of it gave her an insane headache, plus the recent incident and the fact that she hadn't slept much. But she was brought out of her musing by a knock, to which she turned around sharply, trying to see who had come to her. Eventually puts the cup on the table to walk to the door and asked who decided to come in. The person who came in introduced himself. It was Vladimir. The protagonist smiled happily and said that he could come in, but she thought that it was about time because she was starting to get bored. Then the guide appeared in the doorway with Vladimir. All the protagonist thought was that she had seen such a picture before, namely when they entered her carriage, while the passage was covered with snow. The next moment the men bowed to her uncertainly and informed her that he had appeared to beg her pardon. The girl was insanely surprised by such a thing, but still decided to listen to him. Then the man explained that he thought it would be difficult to leave right now because of the snow, and he understood how upset she was, but he still wanted to ask her to wait another day or two. She confidently looking at the bowed man asked what would happen if she didn't agree to something like that and wondered if there were any other reasons for that. And after touching her chin, she thought that the man, instead of telling her such things and what he was doing wrong, could have answered some of her questions. But the man did not even listen to what the girl wanted to know and immediately began to refuse and say that he could not tell her what she wanted to know. She then noticed that apparently he already understood what he was going to talk about. So she looked at him with determination and ordered him to answer her honestly. And then she asked him what had happened to this city and where all the people were. The man could not find the strength to answer her the truth. So falling on his knees and crying, he begged her to just wait here for about 2 days and then they could go, and also convinced me that he could not give her any answers to her questions. The protagonist was clearly unhappy with the picture that was in front of her, so she tiredly exhaled and then waved her hand as a sign that he could already leave. Such a sight made her feel very sick. When Kiria was alone, she lay down on her bed and spread her arms. Looking up at the ceiling, she realized that she was bored out of her mind since her maid was gone. But suddenly she noticed a book she had already read and thought that she should have brought a lot more diverse literature with her on the road. Then looked at the doors and wondered if she could possibly find something suitable if she walked around the house. Then stated that this village was so boring that she had already even memorized how many windows there were in the buildings across the street. Eventually, she set off to find something of interest, but suddenly she stopped uncertainly in front of the door, wondering if it wasn't very polite to peek into other people's rooms. But maybe this way she could find out what these people were hiding from her, and so vehemently unwilling to say. When she opened the doors a little and looked behind them, she found that she was in a room that looked very much like a child's room and was filled with various books, stuffed toys, and more. Then the girl walked over and looked at the photo frames that adorned the wall and thought carefully about the fact that she had not seen children in this hotel before. In one of the portraits in a round frame, she recognized the owner of the hotel and realized that apparently the people next to him were his family. Then she began to spin around again until she spotted one of the books on the shelf next to the stuffed toy. And so it wasn't long before she picked it up and realized that this was definitely the Book of Legends. The legend said that 540 years ago, there was an apocalypse on Earth that destroyed the lives of the people at that time. In their world appeared the great wizard Wallabriga Orenbridge. It was the same great sorceress who defeated the End and afterwards founded her kingdom. After reading a few rows, the girl immediately realized that it was the same legend of the origin of their country and thought about the fact that it had been a long time since she had read such tales. But suddenly, the head of the inn appeared behind her back and asked what she had forgotten here. She turned around nervously, not noticing when he approached, and then, putting the book aside, apologized for the sudden intrusion and said that she was incredibly bored in her room and decided to go for a walk. After that, she apologized again for behaving so unculturally. The man only remained silent. Then the girl awkwardly asked if he even intended to listen to her apology. But he sadly called his head and said that it was not that at all. The girl thought that the man all this time continues to look at the books with all his attention, and it seems as if there is something more than just fairy tales in these books. Suddenly, unexpected for the protagonist, he began to speak and said that the end is in hibernation and they should not disturb it, so their village was hidden. The girl wondered, does the man claim that this very end exists? Then she took the book and wondered if she remembered correctly that this village was called Hercula. And then excitedly, she wondered if the end of the book was really hiding here. He bowed his head and said that they didn't know the details later. They had grown up on this story that had been around since his great-grandfather's time, and the story goes that the end sleeps in this very village. The main character has been watching the man intently all this time and wonders if it's not fiction. After all, even scientists said the country wasn't founded that way and insist that the end, it's just a myth. The man sadly said that he was not at all claiming that this was true. But they have lived by these rules in the village for a long time, and since no one knows who the end is or what he looks like, all they know is that this village was created solely for him, and no one knows if it is for protection or to seal him off. So they just continue to honor the traditions of their ancestors. And afterward informed that the end sleeps in this village, so she shouldn't wake him up and shouldn't go out at night. Korea asked, what would happen if she did go out at night? She was clearly excited waiting for his answer, but he coldly said that no one knew because everyone who had gone out before disappeared as if they had never existed. To her shock, the protagonist immediately recalled the portrait on which the head of the hotel was next to the smiling sun. And then she turned around and saw the very toy that the little boy in the photo was holding in his hands. Then she said that perhaps she'd better go back to her room. When she found herself alone, she immediately began to remember the words of all the people who had said fearfully that they could not answer her, as well as the maid Anna Maria, who argued that under no circumstances should you make any noise or open the windows, and also not to go outside, whatever happened. Deep in her head was the phrase of the heads of the house who reported that no one knew what would happen because everyone who went out disappeared as if they never existed. The girl looked out her window and did not understand what was going on. Earlier, she thought that it was just another fiction, and she wondered if this very end really existed. But she decided for herself that it was literally impossible. The girl stared in horror at the source of the sound, not realizing who it was coming from. She assumed it was from Vladimir, but suddenly, outside her window, she saw a black silhouette approaching her house. That's when she realized that whoever he was very close to her. The protagonist immediately realized that this was completely different from the morning, and after Kiri reached out to close the window, but she realized to her horror that Anna Maria couldn't have forgotten about it. And then she looked around and saw a silhouette in the street. Looking at the silhouette, she tried to recognize who was standing in front of her house, at which point her eyes opened wide with terror and panic and not understanding how she should proceed. Anna Maria stood in front of her house, covering the house where Curia was, her hands blocking something terrible from coming near. Her eyes were clearly filled with determination. At this time, Anna Maria was wielding special magic sheets and shouting at the unknown man to stay away. But to her horror, as soon as the leaves blew closer to him, they immediately turned black and lost all their magical properties, after which they simply fell to the floor. But the girl did not give up and did not stop trying her attacks. She aimed the remains of the magic sheets at the man approaching her and said that she would definitely protect her mistress. While the girl was watching it all from the window and yelling at her that it was very dangerous and that she shouldn't do it. But at this point, she clasped her hands together resolutely and began to reason about what she should do and how she should act. At this time, the unknown man did not hesitate long and decisively turned around. He used his staff as a weapon and pushed Anna Maria, who eventually fell to the snowy ground. Her face contorted, and she didn't understand what to do and how to save herself and Kyria. But suddenly, there was a loud scream from the window from Kiria telling the unknown man to stop. The man's staff was already pointed at the maid's body, but when he heard the protagonist's voice, he stopped. Then she was shocked. Looking at the whole picture, she shouted Anna Maria's name so that she could get to her feet as soon as possible and react. And then she opened the window wide to get a better look at her surroundings. Anna Marie, as soon as she saw this picture and heard Mistress's scream, she immediately shouted to close the window. But it was too late. A sudden rush of wind pulled off the blanket she had previously used to cover her shoulders so it wouldn't be so cold. She tried to take a step back from the open window, and after remaining in the darkness of the room, she found that it was once again too hard to breathe, and a newly familiar sensation overtook her. When she realized her gaze, she found the same man who had attacked Anna Maria before standing calmly in front of her, making no attempt to harm her. The girl was insanely shocked and couldn't find any words to comment on it, and couldn't even say hello. But at that moment, a man scrutinizing her face greeted her on his own. He looked neither dangerous nor aggressive and seemed to be quite optimistic. The girl looked at his eyes and tensed, for they were very familiar. She realized that she had definitely seen them yesterday, and afterwards she remembered how he had greeted her in a friendly manner, and as she gazed into his face, Curia realized that her intuition told her that she should have greeted him. So she tried to look less scared and looked up at him excitedly and said hello back. Something told her that this man was definitely not to be pissed off. Although he looked friendly enough, but his aura was too intimidating. The man saw this reaction of the girl, and so he asked if she was a noblewoman. After lifting her nightgown like a dress, the girl curtsied and then introduced herself as the daughter of the Count of the Buteman family and said her name was Kiria. He tilted his head to the side excitedly and wondered why she was saying county, since as far as he could remember, the Buchanan family was a duchy. The protagonist was truly delighted and surprised that he knew about it, and after awkwardly informing him that the founder of Ballabrig or Winbridge had demoted their family to a county, and herself unhappily remarked that she didn't understand at all what kind of person was in front of her, why he was talking about something that had happened so long ago, as if it were yesterday for him. Then he swung his cane and came closer to her. Then he said it was an interesting decision on the part of the founder, and then he asked her to sit down because he didn't like to talk to someone who was looking down on him. The girl looked at him excitedly, unable to look away, and wondered if perhaps he was just a nobleman who didn't know about their family's demotion. When they were on the same level sitting across from each other, the man smilingly announced that he had become very curious as to why the forest beast had tried to save the girl from him. She stared at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. But suddenly she realized that he was talking about her maid Anna Maria, and it was this accidental phrase that reminded her that the girl was still a native of the forest. Looking at the man in front of her, she said she understood the reasons for his interest, and after apologizing, she asked if she could go and ask someone to take Anna Maria inside, as it was very cold and she would freeze to death if she stayed outside. He still looked at her calmly and informed her that, even in spite of her appearance, she had no manner of speaking. She covered her eyes and let me know that this was really important to her. Then he leaned back in his chair and snapped his fingers, and something glowed brightly on the edge of them. She looked carefully into the darkness, and then the man explained that he had carried the girl to the first floor, and then asked if they could continue the conversation. The protagonist was truly shocked and looking awkwardly at the man in front of her. At first she was silent, but then she asked him what he wanted to talk to her about. The man looked at her carefully and asked who the king was now, and he wondered if the king was still a member of the Orvanbridge family. Then he tapped his finger on the table and asked what generation it was. The protagonist watched every movement carefully, and she was surprised that he was asking about the generation. She did not understand the true nature of it. The question carefully looking him over from head to toe, the protagonist realized that she was not sure that he was an ordinary man, but still answered that the queen was from the 18th generation after the founder of Ballabrig or Winbridge. He listened carefully to her answer and then looked away and said that their conversation was getting very boring. The girl literally froze from this phrase of his and did not know what to answer, as well as what she began to do. She felt very uneasy in the company of this young man. And then she shook as the room became insanely cold, and she felt like she was going to freeze to the bone. Then he wondered without noticing it how she had come to this village. But the girl calmly looked at him and told him that they were caught in a snowstorm not far from her. After he asked if there was something else during their journey, but the protagonist did not understand such a question and asked him again what he meant. Then the young man gave the girl an attentive look and smiled and said that the village was under the seal that Balabrika had put on it. Curia was clearly uncomfortable with this conversation and didn't know what to say to such a thing, as she still thought it was just a common fiction. But suddenly, out of the blue, the man informed her that Curia had broken that seal. Her face expressed nothing but shock at that moment. Then he picked up his cane and reported that he had been in hibernation all this time because of the seal, but it had awakened him. Curia looked at him worriedly, seeming to be completely disbelieving what he was saying, and a little uncertainly informed him that she had not done anything like that, nor had she heard of the seal, so it must be a huge misunderstanding. But suddenly, because of her excuses, she was brought out one specific and clear no, after which the man informed her that it was definitely Curia Vukaman. She gazed intently at the noble young man, then her gaze shifted to his seemingly serpentine and inhuman eyes. She immediately realized that he was scrutinizing her and wanted to know if she was lying or not. Then she simply stated that this whole situation was insanely weird. The protagonist really wasn't lying, because I remember all her life previously no one told her about this seal, and she has nothing to do with it. And as it is, she must not go on making such pathetic excuses for him, and she must behave like a true noblewoman. So having got rid of her fear and assuming the most noble posture and face, she said, as befitted her position, that she quite agreed that the situation that had occurred between them was surprising. The only rule she had memorized in her life was that one must always keep calm and dignity. The next day, the village, previously covered with snow and tormented by a snowstorm, finally blossomed and flowers bloomed, and the birds began to sing and everything around was covered with bright green. The residents who came out could not believe their eyes and sincerely wondered where all the snow had gone. So one woman who went out wondering what had happened to him and ran into her neighbor and asked him what had happened last night, and then complained that because of the heavy snow, it had been a long time since she had been outside. The man then explained that he, too, had been madly surprised by this sudden warming, and then smiling suggested that perhaps they were not without pity. There was an uproar everywhere, and eventually the protagonist, as promised, was going to leave the first day the blizzard was over, so her crew was going to move out. At this time, the protagonist, already dressed in her traveling uniform, was standing near the door of the inn when she was called and told that the carriage was ready to leave. Vladimir excitedly looked at her and said that Anna Maria felt bad, so she would be taken in another carriage, so that the protagonist would not get infected. The girl thanked him sincerely for his care. Afterward, she put up her hand so that he could help her down. Then Vladimir turned to her and asked if he could find out something from her. The latter did not resist his question, and also his interest, so she agreed. Then Vladimir looked at her excitedly and asked her what had happened last night. She eyed him carefully and picked up the words to answer. He turned to look at the aging carriage in front of him, in which Curia was to go, and then he looked at the man who was already sitting there and asked who the man was, who had appeared out of nowhere. As it turned out, last night, between the protagonist and the young man had an unexpected conversation. The guy said that he had to go to the palace to understand the current state of affairs, and he asked if he could join them. She was madly surprised at the question. And then she remembered her ex-fiancé and Rubinia, who had managed to ruin her mood well, and realized that she had just gotten away from those two and didn't want to go back, so she decided not to rush into an agreement just yet, because she needed to find out who that man really was, even if the trip was canceled. Then looked at him awkwardly. She informed him that the carriage could not leave because of the snowfall, so she wondered if he could wait until the snow melted. Then he smiled, and then he laughed and said that humans are very weak creatures. And then he squinted and gave her the most serious look possible and said that humans were such creatures that they couldn't even cope with natural disasters. Taya was shocked by such words from the young man, but then he did not notice it, calmly turned away to the window and looked at the snowfall something was going, and then asked, is it really all that is needed is just to remove the snow? The next moment he raised his hand, and the protagonist was shocked, not knowing what he was doing. She thought he was going to open the window, so she shuddered, because it was very cold outside, and even though she was indoors, she was already freezing. But the next moment, she slowly began to open her eyes without feeling her skin the savage cold. And when she opened them fully, she found a small village standing before her, but now completely cleared of snow as if it had never been there at all. And then shifted her gaze to the young man, who turned to her and waited for some sort of reaction from her. She looked worriedly out the window and occasionally glanced at the young man. She realized that she had never heard of a man being able to use such powerful magic before. Then the man in front of her introduced himself. His name was Nathaniel, and he told her that the locals called him the End or Perdition, and then gave her a very attentive look. When the main character remembered everything that happened last night, she could not give any clear answer to Vladimir, who he was, so she said that this man has been a tremendous support to the Buchanan family, so they should take care of him. Nathaniel, who had heard all this, seemed satisfied with this response from the protagonist and said nothing. Nathaniel looked carefully at Curia and Vlader and then turned to the young man and asked if he was a knight of the family. He introduced himself and bowed his head. At this point, Vasha looked him over carefully from head to toe, and after a brief silence said that he was impressed enough with the knights. Vladimir absolutely did not know how to react to that, so awkwardly looking at him thanked him for such a compliment. If it was a compliment. He looked at Curia and was about to ask him something, but she already knew what he was talking about, so she convinced Blader that Nathaniel wasn't dangerous, although she wasn't sure. Then she came closer to the carriage and already made the first step to be inside, but suddenly she was stopped by the voice of a man who called her by name. When she turned around, she noticed that the owner of the inn was standing in front of her, who looked at her carefully and asked if they could talk. Curia didn't mind at all, so she asked Vladimir to wait for her here and told him not to worry because their conversation wouldn't take long. When they left, the owner asked if this girl had been able to awaken Nathaniel. She awkwardly said that she would like to know the answer to that question, but unfortunately, they had absolutely no such information. And then looking carefully at the man in front of her, she wondered if this man was the doom or end of which he spoke. But he sadly admitted that he didn't know the answer to that question. If you think about it, it was only noticed by children during snowfalls at night, and it never appeared in human form. And then he seriously added that anyone who noticed him disappeared without a trace. She wondered as delicately as she could whether it had caught up with his child. He sadly lowered his gaze, and his silence was the answer for the protagonist. Then the man asked how the girl managed to do it. She awkwardly realized that she herself could not answer this question, and she did not understand could she really remove the seal of the founder. Of course, the royal family kept the art of magic, but a girl who does not possess magic like her could not remove this seal. So she began to think. And then she replied that if she had really awakened Nathaniel, she would have to find out how she had done it. And then she asked if the owner of the inn remembered anything about the deaths, he should send a letter to the house of Buchanan in the village of Arellano. He was madly shocked by such a request from the girl and excitedly inquired, is it really going to take perdition with her? She turned her back and was about to leave and said she had to do it. And then she admitted that she didn't want it to turn out that way. But if he's telling the truth, then this city had a founder's seal on it, and maybe the royal family was hiding this man's existence. So even if she pretends she didn't see anything, the rumors will soon reach the capital, and if they find out about all this later, they might misunderstand the girl. But then she resolutely turned to the man and told him that it was nothing. What she really cared about was that if he was really dead and hibernating in this town, there was no guarantee that if he left the village it would be safe. So she told him that they should do what they could now. The man looked at such a determined noblewoman and admitted that it was the first time he had seen such an attitude from the nobility. The girl only replied that in such a case he should be insanely flattered, and he bowed to her in gratitude for all she was doing, and then smiled brightly and said that they would do their best to help my lady. She smiled at him gratefully and then left. At this time, in the capital of the kingdom of Tribelium raged snowfall, which was clearly not characteristic of this time of year. The queen watched it all, but she was distracted from her thoughts by a rumor that said she had something to report. She held her scepter in her hands and gave the word to the young man in front of her. He bowed and said that people were worried about the snow that had been falling for several days, and there was no particular problem, as the snow melted almost instantly, but the court magicians doubted that it was a normal climatic anomaly. The queen called the magicians to her and asked what they thought about the situation. All of them bowed before the queen and admitted that they could not give a definite answer yet. And one of them reported that this is definitely an unusual weather anomaly, and it looks like someone is controlling this weather, and it's apparently insanely powerful magic. The queen scrutinized the landscape and wondered, is there another mage in the whole kingdom besides her who is able to cause snowfall in the whole kingdom? The chief magician said that they also came to the same conclusion, but it's too early to think about something like that. The queen went to her window and thought that the snow never stopped falling and that it reminded her of something very much. Then she waved her hand and ordered everyone to leave and report back only when they knew something. The mages bowed in agreement with the queen's will, then slowly withdrew. Then another servant approached the queen and informed her that the crown prince wished an audience with her. She was still gazing at the landscape and invited him inside. She thought that something sinister must be raging outside. Then the crown prince entered the royal hall in the company of a girl. All the servants around bowed and welcomed Rubinia into the palace. She walked with the typical nobility, and the prince was clearly very excited to meet the queen. Before entering the audience hall, he turned to the girl, but she assured him that everything would be fine and calmed him down, and then smiled and said that they were obliged to get a marriage license. Eventually, the door swung open and they found themselves in front of the queen. In front of them was the all-knowing Trevorina, 18 Queen Ginger Orenbridge. She looked unhappily at the two young men who had entered. Then Crown Prince Atan, addressing his mother next to his beloved Rubinia Kishner, said that they would like to receive her blessing and tie themselves in marriage. She looked at them scornfully and laughed. Afterwards, she wondered if he meant it in all seriousness. And then turning to the girl, she said that it was certainly very nice of her to be so bold and reckless. But even the queen thought that the girl must see the great gulf between them, and then suggested that perhaps she was blind and a good judge of character. Then Rubinia smiled and glowed and told the queen not to talk nonsense. The prince was shocked at how much the girl was just talking to his mother, the queen, and tried to stop her. Then the prince turned to the queen to smooth things over, but she looked at her son with great contempt and said that she thought she had done, and said enough to make the prince realize that the Buchanan family could not be lost. She wondered if the lad really wanted such a hen to sit on the throne, for then she would dishonor the Orenbridge name. And then she added disappointedly that she couldn't believe her own child could tarnish their family's name. The prince was clearly nervous listening to this and tried to come up with an excuse. Rubinia Kishner, who bowed and knelt, said that she was not of a noble family, but she swore that no matter what misfortunes befell them, her love for the prince would never change. She had a look of determination in her eyes when she said such a thing. And the prince, with tears in his eyes, believed every word he said and looked at her affectionately. But the queen was clearly unimpressed, so with a grudging glance at the girl, she informed her that she wasn't sure if chicken would work instead of pheasant, but she would approve their wedding just to see what would come of it. Then the prince sat down next to his beloved Rubinia Kishner on his knees and thanked her, and then said that he could not believe that she would give her consent. Rubinia Kishner at this time just smiled happily at such a decision from the queen. At this time in the palace after the meeting, Laura was waiting for her personal maid, who inquired how her business meeting had gone. But the maid disgruntledly entered the room and said that she wondered if there was any way out, but still believed that they would not be able to deliver sapphire products this winter, because she was completely unaware that the trade routes on ships would be canceled. And then with a determined fist, she said that all this was annoying her, especially the snowfall. And then she wondered if she should burn all this snow, but her maid, frightened, began to dissuade her, saying that it was a very bad idea, especially since they're in the palace now. But suddenly, she was approached by Rubinia Kishner, who smiled and wondered if Miss Duquesne was in front of her now. She greeted Rubinia Kishner, not understanding why she had come to see her. She only remarked that they had not seen each other for quite a long time, and that it seemed the last time they had met had been at a ball. And then she asked if it was true. Laura didn't understand what this conversation was about, so she gave her a disgruntled look, waiting for any further explanations and clearly not wanting to continue this conversation. But Rubinia Kishner was in a completely different mood. She smiled and asked how Miss Beauchamp was doing, and then said that it seemed the girl had decided to leave to be alone. After this phrase between them increased tension and Laura folded her arms on her chest, confidently looked at her interlocutor, and wondered why she looked so happy. The latter calmly replied that she really had a wonderful event. She smiled and said that Her Majesty had approved her and Ethan's wedding. She was indeed overjoyed at the news. At that moment, Laura's eyes opened wide in shock. She didn't understand how the queen could officially allow such a girl to even think of ascending to the royal throne. And then she looked at her more confidently and asked if she was not ashamed of having stolen another man's fiancé. But the girl calmly explained that Kyria had accepted their love and agreed to break off the engagement. But Laura tiredly remarked that Kyria was a noble, sensible girl, and then asked Rubinia Kishner if it was her father, the Baron, who had taught her to be such an arrogant divorcee. She looked at her like an innocent sheep and said that her family was different from their noble families, and if you look at it logically, Laura and Kyria had achieved absolutely nothing except what they had been given by birthright. And then she said that she's quite arrogant even though she also lost her fiancé. After which she smiled gloatingly, waiting for Laura's reaction. At that moment, Maria interrupted their conversation and asked what they were discussing and asked if she could join their conversation. Maria obviously saw her friend's disgruntled face and knew what she was talking about, but Rubinia Kishner said hello to the Duchess of Old Subed and tried to pretend that nothing had happened. The Duchess was a perfectly demure yet stately lady who looked at Rubinia and asked if she was really interested in the efforts they had all made to achieve their titles. Rubinia explained that she had not been talking about the Duchess earlier, but the girl calmly replied that Miss Beauchamp and Miss Ford were her friends, so she was willing to discuss it with her. But it seems Rubinia Kishner was really afraid of Maria, so she told her to leave as soon as possible, and then warned them that they, too, should prepare for the upcoming event, and smiled threateningly, and said that when she became queen they should be quiet enough. And then she said she was very excited just thinking about it, and she left abruptly. When Maria and Laura were left alone, Maria said that the girls should calm down because it was pointless to prove or say anything to Rubinia. Laura, however, was not satisfied and said that her companion was absolutely right and that it really didn't make any sense. And then she said, unhappily, that they'd end up getting married anyway. Maria only sadly said that in such a case, there would be riots all over the kingdom because some new noblewoman, unknown to anyone, had become the prince's bride, bypassing the Buchanan family, and some people were just waiting for gossip to talk about it. After Maria let out a sigh of relief that with everything that was going on in the royal palace right now, Kyria's decision to go was really great, and then turned to Laura and asked if the girl had contacted her, but she replied excitedly that she hadn't received any letters from her yet. But Kyria had told her when she left that she would contact her as soon as she got there, so maybe the snow had delayed the letters. Maria looked away thoughtfully, hoping that nothing would happen to the girl. Laura, in her turn on the level, looked carefully at the interlocutor and said that Kyria is a well-mannered girl and even in such a situation takes care of others, so nothing should happen to her. So even if something did happen, she would write to them soon. At this time, Kyria herself was awkwardly writing opposite Nathaniel in complete silence, unable to find the right words to strike up a conversation. At this time, the protagonist was thinking about what the young man had said earlier, that he had absolutely no choice but to accompany her. So Kyria realized that I had no choice but to watch him and his actions. And then she looked at him carefully and tried to find an answer to the question of whether she could handle it or not. If Nathaniel really was the end, the protagonist did not understand what he was really capable of. That sudden turn to the protagonist, noticing her scrutinizing gaze, then smiled. And the girl awkwardly noticed that she was nervous even when he was smiling. And apparently that was what he called the calm before the storm. But she realized now that it was much better than it had been last night. But even so, she needed to control the pressure he was putting on her all the time. It was like a predator or a cat that knows when to hide its claws. But suddenly, a man's voice asked if the capital was still the village of Arellano. Nathaniel looked at him worriedly, and then answered that he was right and said that the village was still a symbol of the beautiful capital. Then Nathaniel asked about Lesho. At first, the protagonist did not understand who she was talking about, So she went over in her head the names that could remind her of this person. But suddenly, the image of the Minister of Defense, Lord Lesho, one of the two immortal transcendents who had fought until the end of the war with the founder of the Wallabrig. And it was even said that the sea had been divided with one swing of his sword. Then remember all of this, the main character turned to Nathaniel and said that if he means the Minister of Defense, he is still in Sully, and then added that the man still hasn't appeared in public for over 100 years. And it is said that only a few people see him once or twice a year. But afterwards her eyes opened wide, and she realized that Nathaniel was being overly friendly with the Minister of Defense, and even asking how he was feeling and what's wrong with him. And then she looked thoughtfully at the young man who was sitting in front of her and thinking about something. Then she realized that asking about something like that was no different from an enemy who wanted to kill himself. Then she realized in shock that something didn't add up at all, and that this question would have taken place if he was interested in the enemy's situation for revenge. Then the girl realized that it was all too suspicious, so she couldn't afford to take her eyes off him for a second. Then suddenly, breaking her out of her agonizing musings, Nathaniel asked her how life was. The girl didn't understand the questions, so she asked him to clarify what he meant. Then he looked at her carefully and explained that all the nobles used to fight for power like dogs. At last, the girl understood what the question was about and said that this situation was still taking place. And then, to the embarrassment of the protagonist, said that all people are as pathetic as they are. The girl had absolutely no idea how to comment on something like that, so she just kept silent. The carriage was still moving slowly in its direction, and at the next stop the girl went straight to Vladimir and asked how Anna Maria was doing. He reported that she still hadn't regained consciousness since they left, although her condition was stable. The protagonist was clearly upset by this and asked to be kept informed about her condition, and then thought that Anna Maria is much stronger than usual, and even she still can't recover from what happened. Especially since she faced the person whom everyone around her calls the end or destruction. The protagonist didn't understand how she could just take such a powerful creature away from her, because she didn't even know what would happen. She was glad that luckily everything was quiet for the time being. But if the end turned to her feelings again, a war would break out and she would have to stop him, whatever he did. Then she stopped her thinking and turned to Vladimir, saying that she wanted to stop at the doctor's and ask him to examine Anna Maria because she might have some internal injuries. She still didn't see how she could do that. The protagonist calmly looked out the window and said that they were going to Eltis, and then asked if he would mind if they stopped at some place on the way. He calmly looked at her and said that he owed her a debt, so she shouldn't bother asking about such things. The girl looked at him and thanked his lordship for such a relationship. Then he looked behind her contentedly and asked what their next plan of travel was. Curia explained that she was going to go to the nearby town of Invinik to find a doctor, because Anna Maria's condition was unfortunate. And she thought that while Anna Maria would be at the examination, she would send someone to the capital to report the situation and possibly contact Laura or Maria. But then she would have to act too quickly, because the protagonist knew that in the city there was a strong aristocrat Marquis of Vermont, a meeting with whom the protagonist would like to avoid if possible.